Yivarechecha Adonai Varishmireh.
Shalom everyone, you're all here again with another video for Hebrew in Israel. Today I want to speak actually about a passage and not necessarily word studies or anything of the sort. And people ask, who is the Daniel of Ezekiel 14? Ezekiel 14, the second half of the chapter, mentions a man called Daniel, and this man is mentioned with two other men, Noach and Iyov, and these seem to be characters which were well known to the readers. We know Noach from Genesis, and we know Iyov from the book of Job, but then we have this Daniel. Now, many people want to argue that the Daniel mentioned here is the Daniel of the book of Daniel. Okay, it mentions in the book of Daniel that several men were taken. I'm putting out a Bible here. Several men were taken during the times of King Yehoyakim. This is still when the first temple stood, and they were taken to Babylon and made into slaves of the king, and their names were changed, and so on. Now, the problems I find with this argument is of several points. First of all, the spelling of the name. Now, this might sound arbitrary, but this is very, very important. The spelling in Ezekiel is Daniel. Okay, there's a thing called Kri and Ktiv. Kri is what you actually read. Ktiv is what you write. Now, how the Kri and Ktiv came into being, there are different theories about this. However, it seems to be that the Masoretes had two versions in front of them. At least this is one argument that I know of. And they didn't want to cancel one before the other, so they wrote one down, but then kept another one, which will be the one you read. Now, there are other versions to this subject of Kri and Ktiv. For example, words which became inappropriate, like, for example, Ophalim, which seems to be a type of more of a genitalia disease, and then it became Tcholim, which is more something to do with the other side of the human body. So we find these men, they're brought before the king, their names are changed, and Daniel seems to be a man that has some kind of prophetic abilities. To what level is he a prophet is very interesting. It's a debate that exists to this very day. Was Daniel a prophet? In the Hebrew Bible, he actually appears in the Ketuvim. He is not in the Nevi'im. He's actually in the writings and not in the prophets. Why is this so? It seems to be that this is something that's been around for a very, very long time, prior to the Masoretes by many, many centuries. But in any case, to our point here, the spelling of the name is actually quite crucial. If this is the Daniel of the book of Daniel, how is it that in the book of Daniel it's spelled Daniel with a Yud, while in the book of Ezekiel it's spelled as Daniel? The other side is Daniel really a counterpart of Ezekiel? Some people argue that he was known already at times of Ezekiel. Now, though it's possible that Daniel had already had somewhat of a name in Jerusalem, it doesn't mean that Ezekiel knew who he was. It doesn't mean that people in the exile of Babylon actually knew who he was. Actually, to make the argument that he was now well known before he was brought to the king of Babel is an improbability. He was actually a very, very young man. His name became important much, much later when he became a vizier of the king and an advisor to the king of the Persians as well. And it seems to be that this attempt to link Daniel of the book of Daniel to Daniel based on the periods that these people lived seems to be very, very problematic because of the fact that Daniel actually was unknown prior to him turning into an important figure in the king's court. So I find that very, very improbable. It seems to me that to understand who this Daniel is actually comes from the other names that go together with this name. Now, I never invented this idea. I thought of it many years ago, but then I discovered other scholars already pointed this out. And it seems to be that the reason Daniel is mentioned together with Noach and Iyov has to do with the fact that we're not talking about characters which could be considered Israelites, but general world-known characters. Noach is a man from the flood, prior to the existence of Israel, Yaakov, and so on, prior to the covenant with Abraham. Iyov is a man that lives in the land of Ots. This is not part of the land of Israel. Where is this Ots is a big debate, but at the end of the day, he is not an Israelite. So why would we have suddenly non-Israelite, and suddenly one who is an Israelite, someone who's a Judean? It seems to be an improbability. So I think it's actually safer to argue that Daniel mentioned here is another non-Israelite character. Now there is one Daniel known to us from the ancient Near East, which is a man from the Ugaritic world. Daniel appears in the stories of Akhat. He is a righteous judge, very righteous judge, well known around the world. And he is involved in the whole story of him not having children, but still being very loyal to everything, to his gods and so on. So it does seem to be a little awkward that we mention a man like Daniel in the stories of, in the Bible as in a chastising of the people that they're not keeping the Torah and so on. However, I think the usage of an example of someone who's actually not an Israelite actually fits some of the philosophy of Ezekiel. Israel being found in the desert, Israel being one of the other nations and so on. So I personally believe, and it's my understanding, it's not just a belief, it's actually an understanding through analysis, that the Daniel mentioned in Ezekiel 14 is actually Daniel of the stories of Akhat and not the Daniel in the book of Daniel. Thank you.
Adonai